May 1945. Germany's cities are devastated, reduced to broken streets and shattered buildings. Standing among the ruins are millions of teenagers who had once been praised as the future of the Reich. They had worn uniforms, carried weapons, and pledged loyalty to Adolf Hitler. Now the war has ended, and they are left in a country that no longer exists in the form they were taught to believe in. What became of them after the collapse of the Reich? When Adolf Hitler took power in January 1933, the Hitler Youth was still a relatively small and divided organisation. Established in 1926 under the name Hitlerjugend, it counted fewer than 100,000 members. Within 10 years, however, it would gain the allegiance of nearly every young person in Nazi Germany. Under the leadership of Baldur von Schirach, who had been appointed Reich Youth Leader in 1931, the organisation expanded quickly. The Nazi leadership viewed young people as the cornerstone of their future state, and Schirach's mission was to shape them according to the ideals of the Führer. In December 1936, the law on the Hitler Youth declared membership a civic obligation for all Aryan boys and the girls between the ages of 10 and 18. 3 years later, the Youth Service Decree of March 1939 made participation legally compulsory. From that point on, every child was expected to receive physical training, political instruction, and ideological education in service of the Reich. The organisation was structured according to both age and gender. Boys aged 10 to 14 entered the Deutsches Jungvolk, where they were introduced to drills, outdoor activities, and patriotic songs. At 14, they moved into the Hitlerjugend, where the focus shifted to stamina, weapons training, and strict discipline. Girls joined the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, where emphasis was placed on domestic skills, nursing, and physical health. Through these separate branches, adolescence was transformed into preparation for state service. Regular meetings, parades, and the weekend camps gradually replaced ordinary childhood experiences with loyalty and a militarized routine. When war began on September 1, 1939, the role of the Hitler Youth changed from training to active involvement. Teenagers worked as air raid couriers, fire watchers, and assistants in anti-aircraft units. By 1943, as German casualties increased, older boys were trained in specialized groups such as the HJ Flieger, HJ Marine, and Streifendienst, which served as direct pathways into the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS. Many 17-year-olds were sent into combat, whether on the Eastern Front or operating anti-aircraft guns defending German cities. In 1944, as Allied forces pushed closer to Germany, Hitler once again turned to the youngest generation. Thousands were mobilized into the Volkssturm, the regime's final militia effort. Certain units, including the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, composed largely of volunteers born in 1926, fought with determination. During the battles in Normandy, they became known for their rigid disciplines, but suffered extremely heavy casualties. Others took part in the defense of Berlin in April 1945, armed with Panzerfausts and driven by years of propaganda. By the time the Reich collapsed, the Hitler Youth had lost both its mission and its sense of innocence. Millions of former members were displaced, left without parents, or deeply traumatized. Many leaders escaped or were arrested. Schirach was captured in 1945 and later faced trial at Nuremberg, while Arthur Axmann, who had replaced him in 1940, went into hiding until he was arrested the following year. Historians continue to debate how much responsibility these young followers carried. Some emphasize the element of coercion, especially after 1939 when membership became mandatory. Others point to the powerful influence of years of indoctrination and belief. What remains clear is that by the end of the war, Germany's so-called future generation had become one of its greatest casualties. Children shaped into soldiers and left to grow up in the ruins of a destroyed nation. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Hitler Youth did not slowly fade away. It collapsed almost instantly. Uniforms were hidden, badges destroyed, and flags either burned or buried. What had once been proudly displayed in public squares disappeared in a matter of days. The Allied authorities, alarmed by how deeply Nazi ideas had shaped German children, acted quickly. On October 10, 1945, the Allied Control Council officially banned the Hitler Youth, identifying it as an essential part of the Nazi system. Its buildings and assets were seized, and all organised activities were prohibited. The Allies understood they were facing an unusual situation. Millions of young people who had grown up under dictatorship shaped by propaganda and strict ideological training. In the Western occupation zones, the response focused mainly on education rather than punishment. All Nazi-linked youth organisations were shut down, and new groups were encouraged under church leadership or local civic authorities. The aim was to introduce democratic values and personal responsibility. Teachers, clergy, and American and British youth officers organised camps and discussion circles designed to replace military drills with conversation and critical thinking. In the Soviet occupation zone, the approach followed a different path. Re-education there carried a strong ideological tone. In 1946, the Freie Deutsche Jugend was established as the only permitted youth organisation. Many former Hitler Youth members joined it. While Nazi ideology was replaced with communist doctrine, certain familiar elements remained: uniforms, strict organisation, discipline, and loyalty to the state. East German leaders later described fascism as a problem rooted in the West, while promoting socialist commitment through the FDJ. For some young people, it offered a sense of belonging and a fresh start. For others, it felt like obedience under a different symbol. For the senior figures who had led the movement, accountability came through the courts. At the Nuremberg trials, Baldur von Schirach, head of the Hitler Youth from 1931 to 1940, faced charges for crimes against humanity, including his role in spreading Nazi ideology and organising the deportation of Jews from Vienna during his time as Gauleiter. In October 1946, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Archer Axmann, who had taken over leadership in 1940 and was arrested in December 1945, was later tried by a German denazification court. In May 1949, he received a sentence of 3 years and 3 months for belonging to a criminal organisation, though he was released soon afterwards, stating that he had rejected Nazism. For the roughly 8 million ordinary members at the war's end, the situation was more complicated. Denazification forms required them to report their involvement, but most were categorised simply as followers, rather than offenders. Many were still minors or had lost parents during the war. Authorities in the West quickly recognised that punishing an entire generation was neither realistic nor productive. Instead, efforts were directed toward rebuilding the education system, offering psychological support, and removing Nazi imagery from public spaces. When the Federal Republic of Germany was established in 1949, public debate about the guilt of former Hitler Youth members largely subsided, yet the emotional consequences did not disappear. Many struggled with the realization that the leader they had been taught to admire was gone, and that the beliefs they had accepted were built on lies. By the early 1950s, Germany itself was rebuilding, and so were the young men and women who had once marched in uniform. In both East and West, they faced the same quiet question: how to reconcile a childhood shaped by devotion to a regime that no longer existed. In West Germany, Allied occupation gradually gave way to Reconstruction and the founding of the Federal Republic in 1949. The economic boom known as the Wirtschaftswunder created employment, housing, and stability. Former Hitler Youth members, now mostly in their 20s and 30s, became part of this recovery. Historians later observed that those born roughly between 1922 and 1930, sometimes referred to as the Hitler Youth generation, formed a central part of post-war society. They were often described as disciplined and practical, yet emotionally reserved. In the 1950s and 1960s, open discussion about their past was rare. Many Germans saw themselves primarily as victims of war, displacement and destruction, rather than as participants in the Nazi system. Schools tended to treat the period in abstract terms or avoided it altogether. Former members seldom spoke about their experiences. Some felt shame, others believed they had simply been children following orders. Only occasionally did personal accounts appear, such as those written by journalist Alfons Heck or historian Melita Maschmann, offering insight into the mindset of that generation. In the 1960s and 1970s, however, a younger generation began asking difficult questions. Students confronted their parents about their wartime roles and demanded explanations about moral responsibility. Former Hitler Youth members, now middle-aged, found themselves challenged at home and in public debates. Memoirs, documentaries, and scholarly research gradually examined the lasting effects of Nazi indoctrination. Psychologists later identified common emotional themes: denial mixed with guilt, and even moments of nostalgia complicated by regret. Some former members admitted that they had once felt pride in the sense of unity and excitement they experienced as teenagers, feelings later overshadowed by the knowledge of what that loyalty had supported. Their lives were marked by contradiction, committed as children, reflective, and often troubled as adults. By the 1980s, historians and filmmakers increasingly portrayed the Hitler Youth not only as participants in a criminal regime or as victims of manipulation, but as a generation caught in powerful historical forces. The conversation shifted toward a broader question: How had a modern society managed to shape the thinking of its young so completely, and what warnings did that hold for future generations? In West Germany, public reflection developed gradually. Academic research on the Hitler Youth began appearing in the 1960s, but serious classroom discussion only expanded during the 1980s and 1990s. A younger generation began asking direct questions. Sons and daughters wanted honest answers about their parents' wartime experiences. Universities organised conferences examining what was often called the Hitler Youth generation, focusing on how early indoctrination influenced attitudes toward democracy later in life. Former members gave interviews, many speaking openly for the first time about guilt, silence, and the strict discipline that shaped their adulthood. After German reunification in 1990, scholars also began comparing youth systems in East and West Germany. Some researchers pointed out similarities in structure, uniforms, slogans, organised loyalty, even when the ideology had changed. The comparison reinforced a broader lesson. Totalitarian systems, regardless of political direction, rely heavily on shaping the young to ensure continuity. Today, the Hitler Youth remains banned in Germany, and its symbols are prohibited. At the same time, its history continues to be examined in museums, films, and academic studies. Historians still debate how long its psychological influence lasted, whether it gradually disappeared after the 1970s or quietly shaped attitudes toward authority and conformity for much longer. As with many historical questions, the answer is complex. In the end, the story of the Hitler Youth is not only about the fall of a regime, it is about what happens when an entire generation grows up inside a system that replaces independent thought with obedience. The war ended in 1945, but the process of understanding what had happened continued for decades. The uniforms disappeared, the marches stopped, and the banners were lowered, yet the deeper lesson remained. That rebuilding a society requires more than physical reconstruction. It demands reflection, accountability, and the willingness to question authority. For those millions who once stood in formation as children, the real challenge began after the collapse, learning how to think for themselves in a world very different from the one they had been promised.